We might very well say the Europeans won when it came to meeting the Americans in the 1400s and 1500s. They won in terms of land and wealth and power. But did they lose anything in terms of values? I'm telling the story of US geopolitics, especially with relation to Asia. So I'm starting with something we call the Needham question. Why did Europe advance and collect the power and money, and China did not? After all, great inventions like gunpowder, the magnetic compass, paper, printing press, all of these wonderful things which allowed Europe to succeed so much where other cultures did not, were invented in China. So this question, I like it, it's fun. Why Europe and not China? We might imagine that in 50 years, when or if China and Asia is ruling the world, this probably won't be an interesting question. And we might rather ask, why did China lose control for a couple hundred years? Alternatively, we could ask and have just as much fun with the question, why Europe and not the Ottoman Empire? Or why Europe and not Benin, which was one of the strongest empires in Africa at the time? In the same time as Europe was getting ready to do the voyages, China was already a very advanced naval power. This was what we might call the Ming voyages. This is part of the early Ming time, when the empire was sort of stretching its arms and seeing the extent to which its values were touching neighboring lands. These were not voyages of conquest. This was based on the Chinese tribute system, where the emperor would send an envoy, or a representative, to other nations or other countries, other states at the time, to ask them to say, China is the central #1 kingdom. And it worked pretty well. There wasn't a lot of warfare between China and the neighboring states at this time. This major event was carried out by a guy called Shanghe, maybe, or Shanghe? Sorry, I don't know how to say it. And his boats were 4 or 5 times bigger than Columbus's. He went all over the place, mostly in the Indian Ocean, bringing back a giraffe to the Chinese court. But you know, these guys could have gone to America. You could really imagine these boats were capable of crossing the Pacific. Why didn't they? That's a good question. Sometimes history just happens with coincidences. The emperor at this time, after Zhang He's death in 1433, ended all ocean-going voyages. He just thought it wasn't in his country's interest to be able to go to many different places. He was more concerned with domestic problems. And indeed, China is huge, absolutely huge, and it takes quite a lot of governing capital to keep the kingdom together. So and China had everything they wanted. There wasn't a lot that other countries could give them. Sure, a giraffe is fun, but you don't really need a giraffe to keep a kingdom together. So China didn't have a lot of intrinsic motivation to leave and try to find new territories. Let's look more about what Europe did. One thing is the Ottoman Empire had cut off Europe's trade with China and other countries along the Silk Road. The Ottoman Empire was not completely, but largely hostile to Western European trade. And the taking of Constantinople, and by extension, controlling the Black Sea and much of the easy routes to India, of course, and other important trading partners, gave Europe the motivation to look for new routes. It's important to remember, at this time, by far, the largest economies in the world were China and India and the Ottoman Empire. Nobody in Europe could compete with this. Europe was full of small, fractured states which have been fighting with each other for hundreds of years. And actually, that is helpful, okay? Because Columbus was Italian. Columbus, he's kind of become a hero in America. For school children, they say this little thing: in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Everybody knows this date, 1492. Anyway, Italy wasn't interested in trying to reach Asia by this sea route. But Europe is so small, Columbus could walk over to Spain and ask the Spanish king and queen, hey, you want to pay for me? I'll find you a new way to go to Asia. They said, sure. And until he died, I guess, Columbus thought he found Asia. That's how important Asia was for this. It's just that Europe kind of, again, they got a little bit lucky to reach America, and the story which happened after that greatly influenced the wealth of Europe. Now, we might summarize this by talking about the Columbian Exchange, named after Columbus. I don't think that's a very good title, because exchange hints that something is somewhat equal. And it absolutely was not equal. Another way to read this is the guns, germs, and steel effect, popularized by Jared Diamond in a 1997 book. Although a lot of historians don't like him because he doesn't like to talk about people. He likes to talk about trends and large-scale events, which I don't mind too much. But anyway, take a look at this graphic. Europe got a lot of good food. In fact, you might know the potato ended up influencing European affairs in very dramatic ways, as well as corn. And we talked about how North America only had turkeys as a large or semi-large production animal. But what did the Americans get in exchange? Yeah, as we hinted in the last class, millennia, or thousands of years, of cohabitation with dirty farm animals gave Europeans resistance to diseases like smallpox and the others which you can read on here. But it seems smallpox became the biggest killer of the Americans. And the Europeans didn't even have to try. The populations of the America had a naive immune system, and there was just no defense. It takes generations and generations to develop evolutionary defense against a disease like this. And it depends what your source is, but on the high end, it's estimated that smallpox killed 9 out of 10 Native Americans. Even if that number is half of Native Americans, the disruption to society is unthinkable. Well, what do we mean when we say the steel part of it? Of course, guns and swords are very important technological advantage over the Indians. But the Indians or Native Americans, maybe I should say something about those words. Either word has complications to it. We might also use the word indigenous Americans. I don't want to get too worried about the naming of these things. These days, many of these people refer to themselves as Indians. So as long as it's not confusing with Indians from India, I'm going to keep using the word Indian for this. Okay, well, the Indians had a very systematized form of warfare, and they weren't weak at all. And at this time, guns weren't necessarily a huge tactical advantage, but horses were. The horses were really key in terms of distance you can travel and the ability to reach down and hit people. But I'd like to focus here on the political tactics that the Europeans had. Around this time, there was a famous book called The Prince, written by Machiavelli. In this book, the Machiavelli advised princes in manners such as, being loved is good, but being feared is better. The population can choose to love you or not, depending on their feeling, but they cannot choose to ignore you if they are afraid of you. They must listen to you out of personal survival if they are afraid of you. So he advised Europeans to be strong and fearful when they rule over other people. Now, I certainly don't know much about Indian politics, but it's hard to imagine that their political scheming was as advanced as the Europeans, as most Indians didn't have writing. It seems, as far as we know, only the Aztecs had an advanced system of writing for which they could communicate very complex ideas on. The Inca had a very interesting system of rope tying, which could convey complex information. But the alphabet, in combination with paper, was a very powerful force for transferring ideas. And then we have to introduce luck. It happens that the Incan Empire was in a power battle at the time the Spanish came to attack. And this is probably because smallpox is what killed the king, the emperor, and his heir, the next in line. And there was a big fight for who would get the throne next. And it was at this time that the Spanish could exploit the different power struggles against each other and help to break apart the Incan Empire. Now, this is not the same story everywhere, of course. There's an interesting case of the Iroquois League of Nations, which is roughly the same area of modern-day New York State. Now, this was an interesting confederacy which incorporated and cooperated among many different groups of people. And it seems there was 6 or 7 major groups which sort of shared political power. And they resisted and coexisted with European powers for over 200 years. However, they found themselves between 3 competing, very strong powers. In the north, there was the French, and in the south and west, there was the British and American colonists, who variously made partnerships and broke them, and the Iroquois found themselves unable to survive as a political unit with all of this warfare going on. Although it seems that some of their ideas of their constitution and organization did go into the ideas for making the first American governments. And we also have to say that this is not just about power and money. You know, ideas are important, and values, they matter. Because the Spanish, were they all just evil? Were they all just greedy, and that allowed them to massacre and completely dominate the Indians? Maybe for some. We could imagine some of the leaders, like Columbus, must have been pretty dark in their soul. I mean, after all, one of the first things Columbus wrote when he landed in, I think, the island of Hispaniola was, "These people will make great slaves." But they really believed, that some of these people really believed they were doing God's work. They really believed that God was on their side, and they put a lot of money and time into developing these missions. These Spanish missions gave the people the moral authority to do what was necessary to convert people to the true religion of Christianity. We shouldn't underestimate this force, because it was also part of what became the African slave trade. We'll look at that in section 2 of this talk.